Welcome everyone to another Design Ops Align podcast. I am welcomed by a very special guest from all the way in Australia, who is a very well-renowned UX leader, works for a very well-known company, and I am very glad he's come onto the show today. I know it's a bit in the afternoon for you right now, isn't it, Alex?
Yep, 6 p.m. for me. Not too bad.
Alex, do you want to do a quick introduction about yourself so everyone can know about you?
Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm currently based in Australia, although I have spent since recently the last 6 or 7 years based in the US. And there I was working for various companies, mostly in San Francisco, although I did spend some time on the East Coast as well. I moved to San Francisco. I moved to the US originally because I wanted to challenge myself. I really wanted to be the best in the world, and I felt that the US market was the pinnacle of design. And that was something that my ambition was compelling me to pursue. So I did that. Before then, it was just working in agencies. I did start my own business for a little while, but I've been through a long journey. It's been 20 years, and in that 20 years, things have changed so much. And I think that that's why I'm so interested now in the development of the next generation of designers, because I have that sample size of history when it comes to how designs changed over that 20-year period. And that gives you some insight into what's most important now, what people should be focusing on, and what potentially is a waste of time. For me, I do have a visual design background. I know as much as that can be a little bit a little bit less impressive these days, because it's all about form, function over form, and all of that kind of stuff. But I really do believe in the value of visual design and the aesthetics and what that can contribute to a product, whether it be an application, a website, or even something more experiential, something like an outdoor installation or something like that. Design is really what gives it that quality and what gives it that sense of surprise and delight when users interact with it. And I really don't like when I hear conversations about design is at odds with UX, or are there some way in competing with one another. It's not. It's very much a part of design in all its forms. And I definitely promote that in my role, but I also understand that design has gotten a lot more complex. There's a lot more complexity from stakeholders and business objectives, and that requires a little less of a let's just see what happens, a creative type of approach, like what we were doing back in the early 2000s. To now, we have to be a little bit more strategic. We have to incorporate some of that theatre into the work that we do. So, so as you can probably tell, my story's been vast. I've worked in so many different settings. I've seen things done so badly. I've seen things done so well. And I'm really grateful for my experience, because it has taken me from humble beginnings in Australia. I live in Sydney, but I wasn't even from Sydney. I grew up in the countryside where, there was basically no opportunities for anyone unless you moved out. So, so it's given me a passport to the world, moving to the US, spending time in Europe, in New York, and being just able to work on the types of projects that I've worked on has been a blessing. And I'm really grateful for my career up until this point. But at the same time, I'm still very ambitious. I still want to pursue more and accomplish more. And part of me deep inside feels like I still haven't found what I'm looking for. Not to quote you two there, but that's really what motivates me moving forward now, is how do I really find something that is going to fulfill me in a creative sense, and also give me the opportunity to grow. I very much believe in a beginner's mindset, that I've never felt like I know everything. That now I'm at the position where I can start, standing and commanding and telling everyone how things should be. I always know that I need to learn more. And I think that attitude's allowed me to progress through my career, is that constant hunger to learn new skills and to do new things. Even with my content creation recently, I've never done that before. And I thought, why not? Even though, it does risk showing your vulnerability to your peers and your network. But, you've got one life, and I like to cap. I like to capitalize on opportunities. I don't want to look back and feel like I could have done something and wasted it. But yeah, design has been amazing for me, and I'm really grateful for my career in design.
Wow, that's an introduction. I love that. That is a very, very, and there's a lot for me to dissect from there. And I want to take it from the top on in your in your years of experience in this industry, what do you think is the biggest changes that you've seen so far up to date from your perspective?
Yeah, I think there's been a few different changes or a few different eras, as I generally refer them as. I mean, I started in about 2025, 2005, about 2025. And when I started, it was very much a digital agency setting. There was two types of companies that offered design. There was integrated agencies, I don't even remember the names of them anymore. The acronym type of agencies, Madison Avenue type of agencies, Leo Burnett's, M&C Saatchi, those types of places. And then there was the emergence of the digital agency. And the digital agency kind of came out pioneering this new technology, the internet, digital design. And that was a really interesting time, especially for developing craft and honing creativity, not just functional design skills, but getting a brief like we want to do something really cool. We don't really care what the return on investment is. We just want to blow up the internet or do whatever we can do to get to as close as that as possible. So there was a lot of experimentation, and you see a lot of designers in leadership roles now that have come from that era. And that's because it was so diverse in the technologies that we were working with, in the lack of constraints, no design systems, different clients every month, and always trying to push the parcel to do something different and to, just innovate. And that was really the first phase that I experienced, and that's where I started. So I felt like I had a good opportunity to dive into that space, which was, was high expectations. There was a lot of great work being done, a lot of very artistic work, and I'm really grateful to have done my apprenticeship essentially during that period. And then things kind of shifted a little bit to more, all these big flash websites and creative stuff doesn't make us any money, so let's start being a little bit more pragmatic. Let's create e-commerce websites, and there was even a time where people were creating tabs in Facebook and things like that. But the mindset had changed a little bit from this purely entertainment that we build it and they will come to, okay, now we need to be a little bit more targeted. We need to make sure that we're incorporating out of the analytics, we're hitting the right people with the right information. And I think that was the beginning of the social media stage where everything was just turning to social media. I worked at a digital agency at the time, and we went from doing that very creative um, website design and experiential design to social media, just 100%. And we were designing banners, we were designing, mostly banners, and occasionally we do some cool animations, but that was still banners. So there wasn't really much to get excited about there.
Yeah,
And I think at that stage, I started to get a little bit despondent with the the direction of advertising, and also during that period of time, a lot of those small digital agencies were starting to be sold to bigger integrated agencies. And I think that whole period I kind of see as one. It was like a shift towards social media. It was a buyout of all of these rogue digital agencies that were doing such creative things, but these big agencies were starting to feel like they were missing out. So they just acquired them, brought them in house, and in the process suffocated all the creativity out of them.
yeah.
But I think that was a phase, and it's the agency, social media to integrated agencies, digital agencies, all just coming to one. And then there's the product design phase, which I would say it's 2013 to 2000, or, not too far back in the history now. And then it became about working in house. And like I said, a lot of the pioneers of those early digital agency days walked straight into roles. And I remember thinking like all these sellouts going into Google and Amazon, like, stick with the agencies. That's where the cool work is done. But alas, that turned out to be a good move. And a lot of those ex-agency people that were right on the pulse of innovation and design were able to really capitalize on that shift as those big tech companies were looking to acquire talent from
Yeah.
already established names. So that was the third phase. And and I would say that the most recent phase now is the AI phase, and not
Yeah.
just because it's all AI and everyone's talking about it as as this next best thing, but it has changed everything. And even just when we look at a lot of what was really emphasized during that big tech phase with Google was process, and it was how do we create the best methodology to achieve the best results. And I feel with AI now, that becomes less applicable because we don't need to go through that whole process. We have all the information that's ever been available in the world to identify insights, to form a point of view. And in addition to that, I think it's giving people confidence to not necessarily think that the entire process of design has to be led by a step-by-step process. We're not engineers, and we don't go through kind of to-do lists and do one thing at a time. Like sometimes creativity and design isn't linear. So I think that there's a little bit more of a feeling that perhaps all of this process was a little bit of an overkill. And now with the freedom that AI now has enabled, can we start to get back to something that's a little bit more innovative and start pushing the parcel again to move away from what has been very utilitarian focused over the last 5 or so years. And of course that's for a reason. People want functionality, they want utilitarian, but at the same time, for how long? How long is that going to be sufficient? Do people want more at some point? In every other industry in the history of humankind, something just doesn't stay good forever. There always has to be the next best thing.
That's true. I definitely think that sometimes having an how should you say, over-examined process does kill that creativity. I think one of my key things with processes, and especially coming from a design ops background, do you think that businesses put those processes in place to see optimization in taking ideas to production? Because as mentioned before, when it wasn't really structured, there wasn't really any kind of quantified metrics to say, well, how long did that idea take from conception all the way to production, and could we optimize it in some form of step-by-step process? Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I think that there's definitely truth in that to some extent. That in this day and age, where we're working for businesses and businesses need to make profits, so there has to be an effort to create more efficiencies, and I think that
Yeah.
process has allowed to do that to some extent. Um, and I think that that's mostly due to process working so well with the engineering side of things, because engineering is just more inherently a process orientated craft, or an ability. But when it comes to design, I think that it's a little less predictable,
Hmm.
and sometimes trying to fit it into a very structured process can get you what you expect, but it might not get you more than what you
Yeah.
expect. And,
Yeah.
and to me, that's kind of the essence of design. If we're just kind of doing the same thing over and over again, it's not really design anymore. It's just assembling. So I think it's always important to balance that. You have to have process, of course, like otherwise it's just chaos. And, we can't go back to the early 2000s where everyone was just doing their own thing and being creative. There needs to be some level of process and order in the way that we work. But it just needs to be distinguished from an engineering process, which is very rigid and very step by step, to something that allows for a little bit more flexibility. And it's not the gospel. It's not that, this is how we have to do it. And I do see that quite a lot when people talk about the methodologies they use, and they say, no, we do this and I live and die on whatever this methodology is. And I've never understood that approach. Like, yes, I use methodologies in the work that we do because sometimes it's very complex and we understand nothing about it. So part of that process of acquiring domain knowledge needs to do research and needs to do
Yeah. Yeah.
established processes. Um, but it's never a one size fits all. It's always, okay, well, how can we best get what we need to do or get what we need to extract from this process? And then what is the best methodology to allow us to do that?
I want to kind of dissect that, what you just mentioned. Do you think that since we've kind of introduced design systems and we've integrated, strict processes, UX agile, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, do you think that we've lost the ability to be creative? Or let me actually ask it in another way. Do you think businesses um, have not given the freedom for designers to be creative?
Yeah, I think that that's definitely the pressure that's coming from organizations is
Hmm.
creativity is unpredictable and
Yeah.
hard to measure. So how do we eliminate that? That's a risk for a business that's not thinking about their creative output. They're thinking about the bottom line. So how do they mitigate risk? They can create a design system, which means that there's standardization across all the products, and they can create process that deliver the same results every single time without, without exception, basically. And I think that there is an issue there, and it might be okay now because we're still in the midst of that. That's what everyone's doing. Every company has a
Hmm.
design system. Every company has their own way of doing things. But also good design now is table stakes. Every company, bar a few really poor performers, has good design. They have good products, generally speaking, and it's not enough anymore. So if you're just relying on the same process, the same design systems, then you're going to fall behind because there's one day someone else is going to come out with something new and is going to be able to take a greater market share from you. I do have a bit of a love-hate relationship with design systems. Like, I do really value the efficiencies that they create, not just for the business, but for the design team itself. Like back in the day, trying to be consistent with components and different assets was always a challenge, especially before we had tools that were cloud-based and you had to actually email stuff to
Yeah.
other people before they would get them.
Yeah. Oh wow, you're
But
going back. You're really going back. Like that's
I'm
how
going
you know
back.
that's how you know we're both in that same age because I
Yeah,
remember
yeah.
doing that as well.
Yes,
Yeah.
I'm
So go
giving
on.
giving away my age now. So, design, design do create efficiencies for the team. And we've built a design system with our team, and we always set out to say, okay, well, we don't want this to be something that limits us. We want it to be something that we can grow and can develop on. And the analogy we used was we want it to be a floor, not a ceiling. So we grow up rather than be limited by it. But in theory and as a tagline to a new initiative, it made sense. But in reality, teams start using the design system and it starts getting implemented across various products within the company. And then we want to make an update, but then we have to make an update with every other product. Or we want
Yeah.
to make an update to the design system, but then this team doesn't want to update and they want to do something differently. And it just becomes very reactive rather than feeling like we're driving this design system forward and everyone just plugs into it and comes along for the ride. It's rarely like that. And I think that that's where design systems start to move into that mediocrity space. Like
Yes.
I mentioned
Yeah.
before about kind of getting the same thing with the same process and the same design system. If it can't grow, if it can't continue to innovate, it just becomes this static piece that never really moves forward and never really gives the product anything new. And then the focus becomes more on feature development. So rather than how do we improve this product holistically, how do we look at the entire journey, how do we improve these, very metrical driven things like, let's
Hmm.
move this button 2 millimeters up, or, some minor things that someone has tested and feels like it's going to have a significant impact, but it's all broken down into features. And, when you build a house, you don't just show up with a pile of bricks and start putting things
Yeah.
together. You've got to build the blueprint, the plans, and you've got to have a vision of what that's going to look like before you start. And that's the same with design. And I think that the design systems just have a tendency to lead into that feature by feature development because design systems are a familiar language for developers. So they go, okay, design system, we know how to take it from here and we're going to roll with it rather than a feeling like, we have to actually rise to the occasion and build this vision that the design team set forth.
But then let me take two steps back with this about the whole thing about being creative. One of the key things I've kind of mentioned a lot on the podcast shows I've done in season one is about this whole thing about social media of, you know, and there's some great content creators out there, don't get me wrong. But I believe, and again, I might get slammed about this, I believe that a lot of these content creators show a lot of these creative stuff which have not been brought into a business context. It's like, hey, I've done this project, looks great. But do you, and let me take you actually in a better way. Do you think that being creative in this space has not been taught to translate it into a business context? And let me give you an example. So, like stuff like micro interactions, animations, etc., etc. That's one of the biggest development overheads in all of design. Being able to say, hey, we're going to add in all these different type of micro interactions and animation, but it comes with, hey, does our design system support that? Do we have to change up components? Is there a certain tone of voice, branding that needs to adhere to the micro interactions? And do you feel that people in this industry are not being taught how to translate those creative design elements into a business value context?
Yeah, I think that there's I don't know if it's about them being taught to convert these more creative or surprise and delight elements into a business context. I think that there's a couple of issues there. I think firstly, it's it's difficult for there's almost like an eternal tension between design and development. And I think design very much thinks like, well, we need what we need to make it work. And design thinks, no, we need what we need to make it work, but we also need to make it special, or we need to make it a little bit better than the other product that we're competing against. Um, but then there's also what you mentioned about how does that then fit into the business strategy or even just the
Yeah.
objectives of the business in general. We want to make animations, and they're like, well, how's that going to affect the bottom line? How's that going to make us money? It's just going to add weight to the development. It's going to slow down the process. And one thing that, because you mentioned that, maybe students aren't being taught how to, or aren't being shown how to connect those two things, that, design for design's sake and creativity for creative sake, this doesn't apply in the real world. It's not pragmatic. Um, and I agree with that. I think that good designers need to be pragmatic. They need to understand business. They need to understand stakeholders. And even senior designers that I come across today are still very much, it has to be like this. There's no compromise, and that's just not the way the world works. You've got to compromise. But one thing that I always emphasize that is, it's part of the solution. Of course, it's not the entire solution, but as a designer, you've got to be able to articulate your own decisions.
Yes.
And if you can do that well, then you can convince stakeholders that this micro interaction is valuable because you're able to give them a compelling example, a compelling use case why it is valuable. And that applies to everything that you can implement. And of course, you're not always going to be successful when you do that. And I think that one of the skills that I've been able to develop over the years is that ability to talk about design and talk about it in a way that others feel when I'm talking about it, that it's important. It's not just something to beautify a product or it's just a waste of time or a facade. It has real value and real meaning. And that's such a skill that it took me a long time to develop. And of course, like I said, I'm still learning, but I would like to see young students now starting on that in college, like it's not enough. Like your design's worth nothing if you can't convince someone else that it's worth something. And and that really is when it comes to how do you sell creativity into stubborn clients is that's not on them. They're stubborn because they've got different priorities. It's on you to be
Yeah.
able to present it in a way that's going to be relevant to them and is going to benefit them. It's like all forms of persuasion, but especially in design, it's there's too much. Clients don't know what they need and they don't like all the cool stuff that we do. It's like, well, no, you do a better job of selling it to them. That's the where the tension lies.
I want to dissect something that you mentioned earlier. Now, it's a podcast. I have to play devil's advocate, but you mentioned something about UX and UI. And quote me if I'm wrong. You mentioned that they shouldn't be separated, that they actually should be one. Now, I come from a background of a specialist, and that's why I'll give you my 2 cents in here. I come from the fact of I built teams around specialized UX people who are doing the scientific aspect, and UI people who are doing the graphic design. Now, I'll give you my 2 cents before asking this question. I found during that, I think it was during before the product designer phase, where specialism was kind of a big thing, where UX was really kind of, wireframes. It was the non-pretty stuff. It was all that scientific aspect. And then we moved it over to UI designers who really knew front end component creation, design systems, you know, colors, fonts, that kind of really, really graphic design element. And obviously I think the market has now shifted where product designers need to do that UX and UI. Now, do you think in this next phase that we're going to go through with AI, that it's going to go back to the fact that UX is going to be kind of specialized and AI is going to be kind of helping with the UI implementation? And do you think that we're going to go into a kind of specialist role from your perspective?
Yeah, it's a tough one because I think even in the last 5 years, the definitions of those roles have changed a lot. Um, and I do see that UX and UI, even though research is on the very far end of the spectrum, I still see that as various states of H2O, ice, water, and steam, or whatever they are.
Yeah.
Um, they're two sides of the same coin, and although they're different, and of course, I understand that the tasks that a UX designer or a UX researcher is going to be doing are different than a UI designer or a visual designer. But it can't be siloed. It has to be a single entity working together, and that can be a team or it can be someone that is a full stack designer. And a full stack designer, I think, is something that may be, in my opinion, a little bit more of where we're trending towards with AI, because AI can not just do UI, but it also can do UX. It also can do research. Probably it can do research better than it can do UI or UX. And and my thought, I mean, I don't know. I mean, I'm just hoping that I won't be, completely made redundant or become, the slave of a Android at some point in the future. But I think that where the value of designers should be moving forward as AI becomes more and more a part of what we do is it has to be more from that curation standpoint. There's going to come a time where AI can do comps better than us. It can put together strategies. It can put together research. And the role of designers is to ensure the quality. It's basically to be an art director for all those various disciplines. You need to be able to say, well, that's not quite right. It needs to be more like this. Same as an art director would do with the junior designer. And and I think that that's where designers should focus is not so much on the specialities or the specialist side of things, but understanding everything and being more generalist, I guess you could say.
Generalists, yeah, the
I think
generalists.
I have been, I would say, mostly a generalist throughout my career, and it served me well because I never invested into any particular area. I remember back in the Flash days, I had designer friends that were diving fully into Flash and became Flash developers, and then lost everything when Flash decommissioned. And and to some extent, I think it's the same for these big tech product designers. Now they've spent the last 10 years designing rounded corners on buttons, and how are they going to then apply that if they're given a plethora of options and asked which one is the best one, which one is going to, you know, drive our objectives or even just provide some emotional value to the user. That feels like it could be a bit of a stretch. And I think that being a generalist, understanding design, understanding UX research, understanding strategy, understanding business as well, and being pragmatic in that sense, that's the best skills for this new AI world, because those are human skills. And not saying that AI won't eventually be able to tackle that as well, but I feel like it's the executional side of things that's probably going to go first, and positioning yourself as more of a holistic, high level strategic person or a high level strategic designer is the
Yeah.
way to safeguard yourself.
Enjoying the content? Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn, TikTok, and Instagram for more updates. Your support helps us bring you even more great content. Now let's get back to our podcast.
Absolutely. I think you hit the nail on the head with that one. I think a lot of us are going to be moving into that strategic element and having a seat at the top table rather than being, you know, and I hear it from a lot of people. It's not something I like to hear, but being just the executioner of, designs and not being involved in the product development process is something I hear quite a lot. So I think what I'm seeing now is that gradual shift of UX really coming to our top table, and that UI execution being automated and done by AI. So I'm glad we kind of see eye to eye on that one. Um, Alex, I want to get your take, because you make really great content. That's how we kind of found each other. I really love the content you put out there. And I want to get your take on what's happening right now with juniors coming into the market. Now, obviously, me and you, we're pretty much in that similar age field where we've gone through this transition, and a lot of learning in those transitions as the years has gone. Are you noticing that it's harder for juniors to come into this market right now based on all the requirements that are going to be needed to come into this design field?
Yeah, I definitely have a lot of sympathy for juniors and graduates that are entering into the field now. It's tough, and there were only just a few years ago, the industry was booming. When I was living in San Francisco, it was like you can't walk down the street without being offered a job, and that's not the case anymore. It's the job offers or even the reaches out on LinkedIn are very few and far between, and I can only imagine how difficult that is for junior designers. Or entry level designers. I think that there's a couple of things that are worth noting, and I think that provide a little bit of encouragement for junior designers. Firstly, there is more jobs now than there ever has been when it comes to UX. Even though there's been an economic downturn, there's still a lot of jobs in the world. The problem is there's just a lot more people competing for them.
Yes.
And it's become a real popular path, a career path to pursue. And I think because of the tech boom, some people have seen it as a bit of it's a good way to make good money without necessarily wanting to, not necessarily being passionate about the work. I mean, just to kind of, go back to my early days, and I hate to be the back in my day kind of guy, but there was no money in design. Like, we were earning basically nothing, and it wasn't really for the money. It was because we got to do this type of work, and it was creative.
Yeah.
And it felt like, this was almost like a culmination of all of the talents and all of the signs of creativity that we showed as we were growing up. Now we're able to do as a profession, and that was really the accomplishment. But then, of course, big tech changed that, and it all became about salaries and the massage chairs and everything else. And I think because of that, that kind of sparked a lot of people to go, "Oh, this is an easy pathway. You know, you don't really need to study hard to get into design, but to get a job, that's another question." So I think that that's obviously led to saturation. But I always say that, you know, what that means now is that you've got to be in the top 10%. You can't be a below average designer and expect to get a job. You might get lucky, of course, but if you really want to be a good designer, you have to look at the best designers in the world, the designers that are working at the top companies, the companies that, you know, everyone wants to work for, and you need to look at their portfolios and discern what makes their work good and try and emulate it to the best of your ability and keep trying to get closer and closer to that until you feel like you're getting into that space of the top 10% of designers. So I think that's really the first aspect of that is kind of just framing it a little bit differently and not thinking it's just there's no jobs, there's too many people in the field. But the second thing is I think that at least from what I've been exposed to, the education system has not necessarily done the right thing by a lot of students. I feel like especially when it comes to what students are taught, it's all very generic, and I guess you kind of expect this from academia, but every time we advertise for an intern, I get the same case studies. It starts with the same section at the top, it's the same chart of the methodology, and it's just repetitive and repetitive. And then when I actually look at the design itself, it's like no love's been put into it because they're focused on this case study narrative that I've seen 1,000 times before. And if everyone's doing the same thing, then everyone's getting the same amount of attention, which is practically zero. So I think that some of the responsibility is on the educational institutions, and I'm sure that, you know, they just want to get people through the doors. It's the same here. I teach at university in Sydney, and it's the same thing. You know, we want to get people through the doors, and it's a business. And I'm sure it's the same in different countries as well, at least based on the work that's coming out. It's not about getting people ready to find jobs and giving them a sense of this is the expectation, this is what you need to be, this is the standard of work that you need to be producing to even get your foot in the door. And you know, I know there's always been a little bit of a gap between academia and real life work, but I think those two things in combination is kind of things that people need to consider when they're moving into design. They don't have the knowledge, even if they feel like they've got these beautifully crafted case studies with everything that's ticking the boxes. It's not enough. They might have been first in their class, but are they in that upper echelon when it comes to global design talent? And if the answer is, you know, no for that, then they've got work to do before they can really start to get close.
But then, what would be your biggest advice to people that are creating portfolios with no work experience behind them, and they're probably pulling out case studies of stuff that they've seen that they can improve? What would be your biggest advice to them to get your portfolio to stand out from all the hundreds that are coming in?
Yeah, I think a couple of things. You know, first, you've kind of got to follow greatness, and kind of continuing on from where I was before. You know, go onto LinkedIn, look at the designers who are working at the company, you know, best companies, visit their portfolios, dissect their work, try and understand what is it about that work that makes it good, and then try and emulate it in some way, or at least take inspiration, at least give you a sense of and train your eye to know, okay, well, this is another level of design that my work isn't at yet, so I need to aspire to do that. So you stalk people. You just you know, you not just their portfolios, but the articles they're writing, the opinions they're having, trying to get inside their minds and think like they think, because that's the type of designer that people are hiring. So I think that that's the first thing is you've just got to go out and stalk people and try and learn from people. Like there's, you know, and there's of course, a lot of mentorship and things like that. But I'm not a huge believer in the whole mentorship arrangement. I think it's quite transactional, and I don't know how valuable it is either for the mentor or the mentee. But if you can just go out and proactively and do that yourself, identify top designers and try to force yourself to understand what makes this good. And it takes time, and it takes, you know, a, it takes a lot of effort to do that, but that's really what you got to do. Um, the second thing I would say is you've got to do more than what everyone else is doing. And even if you're doing case studies that are different from everyone else in terms of structure, but you're still showcasing the same project, like it's, an app for a community center or something that I often see when I'm reviewing portfolios, some kind of community-based application that is almost like a personal passion project for the student. You need to make friends with people who have innovative ideas. And when I was a lot younger, I had a friend, and his name was Lucas, and we worked together. He was a creative technologist, and he was a genius, and he played around with processing and a lot of different types of technology that created these almost art pieces with digital technology. Like, they were in galleries and they were interactive. One particular one was, he had a bunch of street artists paint a mural, and another street artist would paint a mural on top of that, another one on top of that. There was about 5 different
Oh,
layers of
what?
street art, and it was all time lapsed. And he created a visual where you could go up and wave through it like that and kind of dig into each layer of the
Wow.
artwork. And that kind of stuff was just like, people love that. Like, there's no real application. It is purely just an art piece. But we collaborated on a bunch of things for some museums and for Fashion Week here in Sydney. And he didn't have the design skills. I had the design skills. I can, make that stuff look good because it's so awesome to begin with. And that
Yeah.
really gave me a lot of really cool projects that no one else had in their portfolios. And I think that people need to think about that now. It's not like go redesign Airbnb or something like that. Try and think of something that's a little bit outside of the box, something that people are going to remember. And there's so
Yeah.
much of that now, like physical technology or wearables, even though that's kind of fading away a little bit. But you think outside the box. It's not all just apps and websites. There's so much more that you can design, and so many cool things that grab attention. And that's where junior designers need to think. They need to think about more innovative. Imagine if you saw someone present a concept for the Las Vegas Sphere in a portfolio. You'd be
Yeah.
like, this is crazy. Where does this kid come up with it? Like, that's the level of cool things that I think young designers need to start thinking about, not apps, not
Yeah.
sort of dense dashboards. Like, maybe have some of that, but make sure that it's augmented with some really exciting pieces.
It's very so. Just as you mentioned, like with juniors, they can do stuff that's very, very creative in some sense. And I do, as I mentioned, I do sympathize a lot with juniors, because it is very, very hard. But it's also hard for people that have been working in a corporate environment, who have been working in a feature factory. And their features are little things which do, again, it could be little features that do bring high impact, but they're little features, or no, sorry, they actually could be just features which doesn't bring that, that visual kind of impact in there, or that, how should you say, doesn't look good in a portfolio. Now, what would you say to a lot of people who are in this situation where they've been working in corporate settings to then update their portfolio in this evolving industry?
Yeah, I think that's a difficult position for a designer to
Mhm.
be in. And
Yeah,
I know that you go to a company like Google, and there's senior designers that basically still operate in that very narrow scope. I think that it's difficult because you have been so hyper focused on a particular area. But again, you need to start thinking about the impact of this more strategically. Like if I've been working on a variety of different buttons, why did we do that? And then how does that affect the business at the end of the day? And start presenting that not just as I did 500 button designs, but we worked on this, you know, button transformation project, and it's about framing it and understanding the bigger impacts of the business. Because if you've found yourself doing that type of work, then you need to start thinking about how you're going to position yourself as a designer if you're going to find another work. Because a whole bunch of buttons and very hyper focused UI is not particularly inspiring unless you're really good at it, which there's not a lot of examples of people that really are good at that very hyper focused UI. But I think it's understanding the context, it's understanding the objectives, and making sure that that's part of your own design story. And you're not saying, we did this, and then we handed it off to the other team, and they pushed the marketing team or whoever. Like you make sure that that's part of your story.
Okay. So when you say like they have to be really focused on the business context within their feature set, would you also say that it's in their remit when they start to work in that kind of narrow feature to start thinking it from a strategic perspective on what their features were and how did they make some form of contribution to the bottom line? Is that what you're mentioning?
Yeah, I think that's what it really comes down to. And I don't think that necessarily needs to be explicit. It doesn't need to be, because we did this, we saved $2 billion.
Okay.
But it needs to it needs to incorporate aspects of other disciplines. It needs to show that there's a strategy to this, that it's not just a bunch of buttons. This was what we tried to accomplish. This is the exploration we did. This is where we ended up, and this is why. And these are the results that were attained by doing that. So it's just ensuring that it's presented in a way that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily going to be a strong design case study, but at least it gives them something to connect it to that's bigger than just UI itself.
Yeah. See, the reason why I asked that question, and it's a really, really hard one, is I've spoken to a lot of, a lot of designers come to me and they say, hey, look, we're trying to show the business value of our designs or the impact, or we're trying to show, this is the MVP and that we've got that. Well, how can we then iterate on it and move on to the actual vision feature when we don't have any tracking to see if we're making impact or general analytics to see if our designs are working? Now, that's, we're talking about middle-sized companies where these designers are. It's a very hard question. How do designers who are working in that context show value in their designs if there's no way of tracking it from your perspective?
Do you mean tracking it from a user validation standpoint?
Yeah, or just a general tracking. Did we make the impact on what this, or did we solve the problem, what this feature was actually meant to do? So, imagine somebody has said, okay, this feature's has come down to us because of XYZ, and we need to achieve ABC from it. Now, if there is no way of tracking that data or seeing if that design has made that impact, how would designers then how can designers even translate that to say my designs did XYZ if there's no way of tracking?
Yeah.
It's a hard one, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that there's, and this is not necessarily the whole answer, but I think that there's definitely a certain level of responsibility that's perhaps been forfeited in design recently. There's like, well, how do we know if it's good design? Like, we haven't had the chance to test it. We haven't had user feedback, and we don't even know anything. Like, you're designers and you have experience, and your instincts are just as valid as data. And you need to lean on those instincts if you don't have other forms of data to lean on. So while you might not get it right because, we don't always get it right, and sometimes even the data misleads us, but there needs to be that element of responsibility that, you need to figure it out. You need to, if we don't know exactly how we're going to determine whether this is successful or not, then that's the problem that we need to solve as designers. It's not just, well, we have, 1 + 1 is, we don't know.
Yeah.
It's the full equation that designers need to figure out.
Okay. I like that answer. I do like that. It's one of the biggest things that I try and help people with, because they just don't have the infrastructure in place to see if their designs are being, just making an impact. But at the same time, um, they don't even have the data to then contribute to a backlog to say, hey, this idea could do this, or, we're looking at your business OKR and we have no data to then back us up that this feature is going to work. And it's one of the biggest hurdles I see a lot of designers going through. So, Alex, I want to get a take on, we found each other again. I found yourself on TikTok. I think it's actually our media team who came across your profile on there, and wanted to get your take. We're coming up the last bit of the podcast, and I want to get your take on what made you want to get into content creation, especially in this field.
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something I've been thinking about doing for a while, and I always liked the idea of it, but never really felt comfortable being in front of a camera. And I think that was more of a fear that was more profound earlier in my career when, I didn't like public speaking or anything like that. Even though I developed those skills as I moved forward, but that same kind of, you know, not like seeing myself on camera continued. Um, but then, I kind of felt like, I needed some kind of creative expression. And I thought, oh, maybe I should, start a t-shirt company and all the typical types of business ideas that people come up with. And I was just looking for something that could keep me going, or could give me a little bit of something different that I'm not getting in my current job. And what I enjoy most is sharing insights. And often I think when I'm working with my team, the most value I can bring is sharing a perspective and or clearly articulating something that may be a little bit hard for someone to articulate, and just framing it in a way that makes sense. And I've always liked doing that with my team. And I started doing mentorship, and I was doing that over and over again. I was getting the same questions asked, and then I thought, this is taking up a lot of time. Maybe I should just create content, and then I can just send it out, and whoever wants to watch it, they can watch it, and they don't have to have all of these scheduled meetings every week. And I posted one video and it was terrible. I watch it sometime just to remind myself how much I've developed my skills since then. Um, and a friend of mine who has a big social media following, and a designer that I used to work with, reached out, and she was like, "Oh, you got to keep going." And I, respected her, and I felt encouraged by that. It's like, well, maybe I will give this a really good go. And I just decided to dig in, and I really enjoyed the process of firstly organizing my thoughts. And I think, when there's so much on your plate and you're very busy, it can be sometimes difficult to create order in your mind, and to be able to then extract the right information at the right time. And creating content was a way for me to firstly write it down, which I think is really helpful, but then make sure that I'm almost like releasing all of my micro opinions on design, and kind of building my philosophy one content or one TikTok video at a time.
Yeah.
And it was just really motivating, and I just really enjoyed. I still do, even though it does get a little bit tough when you don't get the numbers that you like. But I found
Yeah.
it really motivating, and it gave me a lot of energy, and that energy was transferring into different aspects of my life. And it really felt like I had a purpose again. And I know that's quite hyperbolic, but it did really give me a lot of energy and a lot of motivation, and I felt quite quite excited about the potential of continuing to do it. And I just started, and I like to give things a good go. So I'm committed, and I kind of feel like I will not be denied, and I'll keep going until I get some traction, and maybe it leads to something else. But there was always that fear, of course, and I think a lot of people that do this fear the judgment, and especially when you've been in the industry for a long time and a lot of people know you, and you have good relationships with people, but not everyone is your greatest advocate. And when you're putting yourself out there, especially when you're starting out and maybe your content's not exactly refined as what it should be, there's vulnerability there, and that's hard to push through. But for me, I was just like, look, if I don't do something, there's not much else that I can really look forward to except for a continuation in corporate design. So I thought, I'll just do it and keep with it, and maybe it'll grow, maybe it'll lead to something else. But because I'm enjoying the process, and it's done so much for my clarity and my ability to organize my thoughts around design. It's a two-way street. It's not just about making it big or getting traction. It's therapeutic.
Well, look, I'll give you my 2 cents. I'll give you my honest 2 cents. Our marketing team, who normally scour like the whole social media platforms, and we always try and find great guests. There's a certain criteria that we have in finding guests. And one of the key things, and one of the key things me and my business partners really put in there is what is the type of messaging that they're putting out that is really making an impact. As mentioned it before, there's a lot of people who create content which we don't believe is correct from our point of view, that are probably misleading in some sense. And I'll give you my 2 cents what the marketing team came back to me. They loved your content. They love your content. I think they share it quite a lot, or they're always watching what you do. And I'll be honest with you. I love watching your content. It's amazing.
Thank you.
The messaging you put out, the things that you're putting out is real life context, real value, real things that you're putting out. Now, obviously, in a design ops perspective, we always have a balance. We're not always saying that we're writing this and we're writing that. I think everyone's got their own way of doing stuff, but there is a way, how should I say it? There is a correct way of doing this in this industry. And I believe that the content that you really do put out is going to resonate with people in real life situations, and not, how should you say, cherry coat it or give you just like the 10% of what it is. You're really talking about real life situations. And yeah, I would say keep going, man, because it's amazing stuff. And yeah, you're on the podcast right now. I think you've been on a few podcasts as well since you've been creating your content. So
yeah. Thank you. I appreciate you saying that. And it's always good to get encouragement, because sometimes you do need that.
Yeah. No, I get that. And, I do understand that we do look at numbers, we do look at those numbers of hits. It is a key metric, but I think is, as your colleague mentioned, you keep going, you keep pushing the word out, it starts spreading. And, we're thankful that you've come onto our podcast show. So that means a lot to us that you took the time out to kind of speak with us, and we really appreciate it. So
absolutely. It's been my pleasure.
Nice one, Alex. So keep up the good work, and we will keep an eye out for you, and we'll definitely love to bring you back on the show again.
Yeah, absolutely. Would love to.